Okay, thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much for inviting me to quite a salubrious occasion. I'll just share my screen now, and hopefully it's all happening. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Helen. Can you see that screen? Is that all okay? I'll assume yes.
Yes, that's fine, Gary. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yes, I will be talking about Bouldnor Cliff today, but part of the rationale for this discussion was to link it to public outreach and underwater cultural heritage and public outreach. So I will start talking really about about my role in the trust rather than with the University of York at the moment, and Bouldnor Cliff in the trust, and that element of public outreach and how the trust tends to work in that dynamic and how it needs that public outreach for the society, let's say, to appreciate the work we do. And it goes back about 30 years when we were set up, 1991, to promote interest, research and knowledge of the maritime archaeological heritage and for the advancement of engagement with the public. So we needed to really look into this maritime archaeology. A lot of it was shipwrecks at the time, and try to reach out to the public and let them engage with it as well. Now, that was a bit tricky because what we had really, apart from ships like the Mary Rose that came up, we just had a lot of dots on the map. So it's how do you really get people to engage with all this broad cultural heritage? We can start in the Intertidal Zone. And of course, here we have lots and lots of wrecks that are under threat. So this is something that you can grab the attention of the public for this particular site here. Lots of publicity back in the 1990s, a lot of interest. Even so, we didn't manage to save it. It was a site that was under threat. It ended up being burnt, but there were lots of complaints about some smoke in people's washing, so they had to stop the burning. It affected people's nice clean sheets, but we had to go underwater, so we had to try and get the images from underwater. Also, I introduced people to the hundreds and thousands of ships and sites that were underwater, and how were we going to do that if you couldn't get people to see them? You just couldn't really stoke the interest. So we started to work with photography and identify the sites, but you can only see a little bit at a time, especially around the sort of we're talking here and sort of in the channel, the English Channel area where visibility is limited. So you've got sites like naval vessels, warships like Hasdis 1706. We'd look at cargo vessels like the Fenner 1818 with lots of barrels and sheets of glass, really well preserved underwater, an incredible resource, but you just can't really get it to the surface very easily for people to engage, which is part of our remit. And things like the SSS Eleanor 1918, full of mines and ordnance. Still, there were thousands of ships, warships on the seabed, and war graves, but these were just under the radar. Very few people would see them. So we set about, through the trust, to go ahead and try and raise interest to these sites. And I was mindful as a diver that I could see these sites, but I couldn't get them to all the other millions of people that couldn't see them. So we had to think of ways of doing so. So as you could only see a bit at a time, we used the information to try and create models on the seabed. And with those models, we could then introduce them and promote them through education programs. This one here is a collaborative program working with the Dutch, so with the Belgians, the French and the British, looking at a British ship being manned by the French and owned by the Belgians. Get it right? And that was a ship, because of the international nature of it. We developed an education program working with schools in the 3 different countries and trying to get people to link to this First World War wreck by people they might have known or engaged with, or that some of their relatives might have been associated with. And we got them to develop programs around the site to understand the sinking, how the ship went down, what has happened to it on the seabed. It's now an artificial reef. It's also a grave. It's a multitude of things, not just the underwater cultural heritage, because we have to be as multidisciplinary as we can with that outlook to engage lots of people in this heritage for all the different aspects of it. So it becomes a key tool for ocean literacy. And we've got things like a maritime bus, which we've got methods. We take the information around Europe to the Mediterranean and around the UK. So all these different elements we've had to develop and devise really to try and make sure that not just researchers, but of course people, the community, the public engage with it, because once they engage with it, it becomes significant. And then it's a job then there will be ongoing support for us if it's recognised as something of value and for the underwater cultural heritage. The next step, of course, is to start looking at more technology. So 10 years ago, all this World Wide Web stuff and drones and Google Earth came to play. So we started using it to see if we could tell the story of the underwater cultural heritage. And of course, here we can start with the intertidal cultural heritage, to try and tell that story, to get it out to as wide an audience as possible, using 3D models. Jonathan showed some wonderful ones just now, same sort of technology, to try and give people sort of access to these sites. Great intertidal areas tend to be, well, all challenging, but sometimes not quite as challenging as underwater sites. So we tended to apply some of that information, take it underwater, and turn it into a resource to make it accessible to people through their computers, using gaming technology, to make it a resource that people can actually get to these sites and look around it and start to appreciate all these different massive resources underwater. All this was entered through a web-based portal. You can then get to this information and also navigate around it with modern gaming toys and 3D, etc. So you can put yourself on the seabed. Whole aim was really to get people down there so they could recognize the underwater cultural heritage, engage with it, and so they would make it significant and hopefully influence policymakers. But what about these submerged landscapes that we're here really to talk about? Well, they're sort of not quite as exciting in many ways. I mean, we've seen some wonderful examples this morning and yesterday, some wonderful research about these landscapes, intertidal and underwater, and a lot of the really fundamental research questions that they can address and that can be answered by looking at them. But this is something sometimes it's hard to sell to the public. But this is something that we started to do about, again, in the mid-1990s, happened to be led by the archaeologist of the Isle of Wight, David Tomlin, who you just saw with a 3D headset on previously. But he was down in the Isle of Wight in the Intertidal Zone, and he was seeing all these sort of submerged forests and Roman and Neolithic bits of material coming out of the seabed. And he recognized they were, well, some just being revealed, but also they were very interesting to help understand climate change, cultural change, or sea level rise through time. It could be used for index points, etc. And this is something that we're discovering more and more. The more we look, the more we tend to find. And these are sites that just recently been discovered over the last year on the northwest side of the Solent. And here we have a Neolithic forest. You have the date at the top, about 5,000 years ago. And associated with that, we had some nice Neolithic sites of habitation or occupation, Neolithic posts. This is one of several different features we found in the area, dated to just before the inundation. So they looked like there were some estuarine settlements and occupation on the coastline. These were utilizing or using those coastal resources, but significantly, these posts still survive. These were buried, of course, in the mudflats, but they still survive today. Recently, we've just come across another Bronze Age material. So as well as Neolithic, you've got the Bronze Age. This basket looks like a fishing basket. We've yet to look at it in more detail. The trouble is it tends to get covered in water. It looks like it's built in a pit, but it's at the low water mark. And as the tide comes up, of course, it covers it and, covers it. So it makes it less accessible for archaeologists and also less accessible for the public to see and understand what's going on. So we do look at some of these sites, and of course, nearby, a site that's only 10 kilometers away, another bunch of Bronze Age posts from 1447 to 1373, Carl BC, an area that there's dozens of posts, would have been the basis for a structure that would have been at the time in the intertidal zone. But as soon as you go below the funny lumps and bumps that are exposed on the surface of the intertidal zone, you can start seeing wonderfully preserved remnants of these Bronze Age features. I mean, it's not quite a must farm, but we have some incredibly well-preserved relics that can tell us about sort of interaction with the coastline and coastal exploitation through the ages, to address some of the research questions that Jeff has raised earlier. And when looking at preservation, here we can see some very fine cut marks from Roman material from the same sort of area. So we've got sort of Neolithic here, we've got sort of Bronze Age going through the stages, and we've got some Bronze Age about 1000 BC, and we've got Roman from just after the conquest here of Great Britain, and then some sort of later Roman features as well that are sticking out the foreshore. So we have a massive resource in this intertidal zone, which is great, but the reason we've got it and the reason we can see it is because all the protective sediments that were once there are now gone, making it accessible. They're gone or they're going. And you can see that if you have a look at this aerial shot of the region. This is in the northwest Solent of Hampshire, between Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. This was an area that was once covered in mudflats by Calshot, but now looking down towards the west, we can see the whole area has been stripped. And if we put the water back, of course, that's great. You can't see it so well, but now all those exposed bits of timber are being eroded away pretty quickly, particularly by the marine boring organisms. So all that resource is steadily being lost. So what we want to find nice areas like this, which is another part of the Solent, and I will show you a map in a second to give you a better idea where it all is. Then the other part of the Solent, where we do have these mudflats still remaining, and it's underneath these mudflats that we can find the material. And this has been alluded to by a lot of the work in Dogger Bank and the North Sea, where you have these thick deposits of Holocene sediments below which we know the land surfaces do remain. What we have in the Solent is an area where these land surfaces do remain and we can actually get to them. I've just been showing you the sort of material that we can find on the shores of the Solent, and shortly I will go underwater to Bouldnor Cliff. And so Bouldnor Cliff is marked here with the big arrow, and this is on the south side of the Solent. And just now I was showing you, oops, there. And just now I was showing you images from just up area here off Calshot, looking down to the west. And all these areas here were once covered, or literally decades ago, 100 decades ago, and going back for a few hundred years, were covered in mudflats all the way to the extent down here. In fact, this channel has only been formed about 3,000 years ago, before which it was an estuarine basin, not dissimilar to some of these harbours over here, Portsmouth Harbour, Langston Harbour. But of course, this is the UK at the bottom here, and the Isle of Wight is right at the south of the UK, for those that aren't familiar with it. But this was been a nice sort of sheltered estuarine embayment until about 3,000 years ago, and meters of sediment, just like the sediment I showed you in the last slide, built up within it. And you can still see some of that sediment that remains underwater. I should say the bottom of the area here, the sea level came in about sort of 8,200 years ago and started flooding this basin. And from about 8,200 years ago onwards, the sediment built up until 3,000 years ago, when a new channel came through and took that sediment away. And looking at Bouldnor Cliff itself, you can see the top of those sediments, that's the top of a mudflat deposit, an alluvial deposit that was built up from 8,000 BC onwards. And there's an edge here, and at that edge, there's a cliff. And going underwater, this top pink area here is the top of that cliff. Well, that's the top of that sort of covering alluvial sediment here, and it drops for 7 meters. Drops for 7 meters. And this cliff here, it's vertical at 7 meters, and this is all that soft alluvial sediment that is a bit like cream cheese when you put your hand in it. And at the bottom, there's a more robust strip here that's sticking out, because the erosion has come from this way in, and it's a long section that stretches for a kilometre, but at the base of it, you've got this nice, pretty flat surface. It's a peat deposit embedded with trees and woodlands and streams. As well as that, we discovered archaeological features. Looking in section at the site, there's a section cutting across that cliff. You've got the top here in 4 meters of water, drops down to about 11 meters down here. This platform, 12 meters right at the very base. This is below a British ordnance datum rather than chart datum. And within it, you've got this sort of marine brackish clay, and then you've got these seams of peat and a basal deposit at the bottom. Very murky in the Solent, very green. But this little bench here, this woodland bench with trees, has sort of been defended by tree stumps which are then eroding away as the sediment moves towards it to get rid of it. But as well as the sea eroding, we also have marine life digging holes in it. And this is a lobster sitting underneath, as you can see, a lobster sitting underneath a large oak tree. And here's the oak tree at the top of the picture here, with bark on it still. That's tumbled, it's got underneath in some soft sandy silt, and it's excavated lots and lots of flints. And it was these flints that we discovered back in 1998, 99, which led us, we excavated the back of the lobster burrow, and it led us to a site, a stratified site, where we found in situ lithics embedded within a sort of peat horizon, and lots of archaeological material, and dated, as you can see here, 6,000 Cal BC, to 6,060 to 5,900, so about 8,000 years ago. Quite a tight time scale when this particular land built up just before the sea came in and overtook it and flooded it. When you go down there today, this is all sort of eroding away quite quickly. We still have those root systems in place defending it. All these are going back the contemporaneous with the land surface, 8,000 to some sort of 8,200 years old. And then amongst that, we've also found more archaeology. And this archaeology, which is quite significant, of course, is timbers, and lots of bits of timbers. Two main sites, about 400 meters apart. One of them has lithics, but mainly timbers. The other one is dominated by lithics. This is the one where we mainly have timbers. And what we found, which were a bit anomalous, we found these sort of pieces of wood laid out in what looked like organized fashions. They're flat on one side and they were curved on the other. And you can see them in situ at the site here. And then if we look at some of them in the lab, you can see they're nice and flat and squared on one side. When you look at them, it's hard to distinguish whether they're worked or not. It's really where we're seeing them in the assemblage that it's giving us indications that they are anthropogenic. But you turn them over, of course, I should say, in amongst them, you do have a whole bunch of nicely fine chopped or worked pieces, of which there isn't an analog in the Mesolithic record. So we're not quite sure what the purpose is. But when we turn them over, we can see they're all round on the other side. This was something we weren't quite sure what they were, but detailed analysis over the last few years has identified that most of these things are oak, but they're all bark and sapwood. So what we have is the remains of an oak tree that's been stripped, bark and sapwood, and all these bits of timber are then being laid on the seabed. And it was making sense to them, and we found about 4 or 5 of these particular sort of clusters, or organized pieces of wood lying on the seabed. It wasn't really until last year when we identified a particularly large one with over 60 pieces of timber, and we're diving on the site yesterday, and we found another sort of half dozen which are starting to erode from out the seabed. About 60 pieces of timber that have been laid crisscross right angles on top of each other to form some form of platform, and the platform was just next to this, over to the left of the picture at the top here. There's sort of a fluvial outcrop that was coming out from underneath the peat. So there's a peat deposit on here. This timber platform came just from this area here, which WFO4 within the peat platform. And last year we recovered it and excavated it, and you can see the actual bark on it, and you can see how it's fitting together with the sapwood. And they're all, about sort of 30 to 60 centimeters long, these pieces of timber that have been stripped from an oak tree. And back in 2007, we found what we believe to be that oak tree that they were stripped from. And of course, there's been several of these sites laid around this area that we're looking at. And central to this piece of timber was a large central to this collection of timbers was a large flat piece. So all this area to the top had been eroded away. So all that was left was this sort of cluster here and one piece at the top. This large piece here was about 1 meter long, 60 centimeters wide, and it was hewn from a slow-grown oak tree, and it was tangentially split. That means it could be one large plank that could have been many meters long and about 1 meter wide. Almost 1 meter, yeah, it came from a tree that was about 1 meter wide. So it could have been many meters long and 1 meter wide big planks, or it could have been the base of a log boat. and as it happens, we found many other clues, burnt flints, burning, etc., that indicate that it looks like they were working, building a boat, or maybe hollowing out a structure or a timber or a tree, as well as all this evidence about stripping the bark from it and reusing it. And so the most probable explanation will be a logboat. What's more, sea level was rising at this point, of course. The channel was starting to connect with the North Sea around our region. Sea level was rising, and there was a lot more water about, arguably, simplistically, and the use of a logboat would have been a much quicker and easier way to transport goods to and from around the south coast, and as necessary over to mainland Europe. A challenge has always been, though, to get people to understand this. We've been working on the site now for over 20 years, and it's really difficult for non-divers to go down and understand and see the nature of the seabed and understand it. So we've been using this photogrammetry underwater in these bad conditions and putting them together to form these images of maybe sort of 800-900 pictures to try and recreate the 3D area. And hopefully this will work. Oh, sorry about this. And this, and so we're building up with many pictures when the visibility allows us better images of this subterranean or submerged land surface. What we have here, the nice trees, but an area that's quite interesting is just at the back of in the middle of the picture here, that little seam, that little cliff that's eroding away. And it's just below that, on a little plateau of sort of humic material, that we're finding lots and lots of more of these pieces of timber eroding out the cliff. We're just getting to these sites as that cliff steadily erodes back. That little cliff there that's protected, little embayment in between those tree root systems, is eroding back, and as it does, it's revealing more and more these bits of timber. And we're down on the site yesterday, and you can see the sort of timbers that are coming out. These couple of bits here coming up at an angle, but they're flat on one side and they're sort of round and trimmed on the other. Two of those sort of comparable bits of timber that we've seen all around the region that will be associated with that sort of stripping of that tree in the middle of the site. There's also those sort of ubiquitous flint tools on the sites, and we're having transit-axes or adzes, as well as tools, bladelets and scrapers, finding across the site, and in particular we're finding them at this location 400 meters away, where they're falling out of a sand deposit near number 8. You can just sort of make out an 8 and 9, there's sort of sand in amongst lumps of clay. That's a Holocene clay deposit on top, breaking up, falling down, and it's sitting on top of what used to be a point bar system 8,000 years ago that people lived on. And as that clay breaks down, the sand is pouring out from underneath it. And when you go down and have a look at the site, you can see the sand that's coming out from underneath the clay, and as it comes out, is bringing out these lithics with it. And this is another adze that we picked up, discovered that had come out the site. At the moment, we're looking at the distribution of these adzes to really look at the concentration of material to identify the area that's got the main center for the occupation area on top of that, the dune system. But that was an area that we looked at last, despite the COVID. We got out to the site last November, and while there, we came up with about 30, 40 more lithics, flakes and blades and tools that had been sort of eroded from the environment. We were just out there yesterday. Oh, and there's a collection. So there's various tools, scrapers, adzes, the heads of transit-axes at the back there that have been broken off, a myriad of different tools. And out there yesterday, and in the same location, more flints just being rolled down on top of that sand deposit. And a quick shot last night I thought I'd include, to give you an idea, little bladelets, core up there on the left, and a little that bladelet with a scraper on the end at the bottom in the center. In addition to all this sort of wood and all these flints, we found things like string, and we found bone. This particular auroch bone was interesting. That came from the site where the flints came from, because that married in with some of the analysis of cedar DNA that was conducted with Vince Gaffney and with work, Robin Alby at Warwick University, and identifying a whole range of evidence for a whole range of life, be it aurochs, dogs, duck, rodents, etc., etc. But included in that was wheat, which of course is rather significant. So when we're trying to push back our understanding of how people moved and linked through time, in many ways we need to look at these sort of underwater archaeological sites, which, as Jeff pointed out right at the beginning, cover such large tracts of land around the continental shelf that were occupied, and all of which is largely overlooked, that we need to look at some of these areas to see if we can draw some more information, more understanding about human dispersal, cultural human dispersal, and understanding the various different cultures. So we're coming back to this need, I suppose, for disseminating the information as widely as possible. We can do that with pictures, with videos. We're trying to do that with 3D models and, of course, paintings. But it's a long time ago, and the artifacts aren't quite as dramatic as shipwrecks. But here we have a reconstruction of the site, logboat being built on the right there, of course, auroch in the background, dogs. A lot of this elements of this image are built up on the pollen and all the cedar DNA evidence. And we have someone here making what could be some form of beef burger just by the fire in the middle here. And I'll just finish with another, going back to the decade of ocean science and sustainable development, looking at the outcomes, something that Helen alluded to just now, because I can see that when it comes to dissemination and outreach, I see it's an opportunity for the likes of us within a Maritime Archaeological Trust to look to see how we can use the evidence we're finding with the shipwrecks and the submerged landscapes to feed into some of those sustainable development goals and help us better understand and link with the oceans and the sea. And I suppose get the information out into a very broad spectrum of people. We want to work within the academic community as much as we do, because that's what we do as well, but we do need to leak out into the much broader community as best we can. So on that note, I'll say thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Helen.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. I mean, it's fantastic to see the development of what's been happening at that site, because I've been sort of watching it now for a number of years, and it's so good to see the photogrammetry, because it really does change how we can see the site and how you can share it as well. So in terms of outreach, it's just brilliant. It works so well, because we all know that diving there in the Solent can be like diving in cold tea quite often. You don't see very much. So it's a really good way to actually be able to properly see the site. We do have a question just quickly from Duncan Ross, who says, is the erosion at Bouldnor considered a positive in some ways, as it sometimes reveals the archaeology?
Sort of yes and no, because when it reveals it, I mean, the platform was something that if it wasn't revealed, we might never have seen that. But once it reveals it, a lot of the damage has been done. A lot of the detail is washed and eroded away. And I think that was demonstrated by those posts I showed from the Intertidal Zone. At the tops of the posts, you just see all griddled and eaten away material, but it's only the material that's protected that really has the information we need to try and address some of those broader research questions. So really, we want to be going in there for archaeological purposes to excavate before it's eroded.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very much looking forward to seeing a whole logboat and a paddle, please, actually, Gary. Oh, we have got one other question that's just come in from Gil, or is it Jill Hay? Hi, Gary, what is the earliest date you have got for wheat?
Well, the earliest date we've got at Bouldnor Cliff, that comes, remember, it's about 8,000 years, give or take, so 20 or 30 years. That's the date we have, the oldest date we have at Bouldnor Cliff. In the UK, it's well, you're moving on a couple of thousand years, and prior to that, you're going to the about 11,000 years ago into the Middle East, when you're going to North Turkey, North Iraq areas. But this is the oldest evidence of wheat in the UK by a couple of thousand years.